Hey, this is Mike. I'm going to walk you through some custom scripting in NetSuite using a concrete example that we run into a lot. And so I figured instead of just doing this on my own, I could walk it through on a video and kind of show how we think about scripting in NetSuite and some of the things you can do. So my goal here is to write a script. Well, it's already written, so I'm just going to implement it, that changes a field on a NetSuite transaction when the transaction is created or edited based on some data on the transaction. So to make it super concrete, we want to set a Stripe account ID and a specific custom field on an invoice based on the currency. Now, how are we going to do that? First thing, we need a field that we can put the account ID on. Now, we could use a standard field, but for this example, we're going to create a new custom field. The other thing we're going to need is a hook to actually add in that value at the appropriate time. In this particular case, the best option is an after submit hook. It's not technically called a hook in NetSuite. It's actually called a user event. And what that is it's a script that you can run based on essentially a database event. NetSuite has a couple different events that you can choose from. One of them is before submit, after submit. There's a bunch of others that will actually modify the page that's loaded. So that would be before load. You can actually remove buttons or disable buttons or add in an iframe into a particular NetSuite form or view on a specific record. But for this particular example, we're going to use an after submit. Now, the reason we're using an after submit instead of a before submit is the before submit can affect other synchronous processes that are working in NetSuite. So a concrete example there is if you have an external API that's creating a record using SuiteTalk, which is essentially NetSuite's closest thing you can get to their a standard REST API, except it's SOAP, so it's XML. What could happen there is if you're creating a record through the SOAP API, NetSuite is going to run all these before submit scripts that are loaded into the particular NetSuite account. And if any of them trigger an error, it's also going to cause your operation to fail, your external API operation to fail. That's problematic because it creates additional errors that an external integration could get or could be affected by that aren't tied to that integration's operation at all. And depending on exactly how the integration is built, this might cause that integration to create duplicate records or just receive that error and then not retry the request again. So it's always safest if it's a non-critical operation to use an after submit hook or after submit event, because if the event fails, you'll still get an error about it on the NetSuite side, but it won't cause any dependent operations that are kind of hooked into the particular call that to NetSuite that's being made to also fail. So that's something to think about in general when you're developing scripts, is which type of event or script to use. Another thing I'll call out here is the user events are helpful in a majority of cases, but scheduled scripts can often be a better choice. And what a scheduled script will do is essentially you can think of it as a map reduce operation. You can set NetSuite to run a script at a particular time every day or at a particular interval, and it will run that script and you can load in a bunch of records and process them one by one. This is more reliable than the after submit events because if it fails, you can just rerun that record at a later time. If an after submit event fails for any reason, it could be because an external network connection fails if you're doing an API request, or NetSuite just throws an unexpected error, or NetSuite times out. There's lots of errors that you can't control or predict that could happen during an after submit call or a before submit call. And if one of those things occurs, it's going to cause the entire script to blow up, and there's no retry mechanism in NetSuite if that occurs. So if you're dealing with an operation where you need to ensure 100% of the time that operation is completed, an after submit event may not be the right approach. I'd recommend either using a scheduled script or building a polling mechanism using NetSuite's SuiteTalk API, which is a whole nother conversation. So in any case, that's the other piece of the puzzle here, is we're going to create this script deployment for the after submit event in addition to that custom field. So those are the two things we're going to do. I'm going to walk through the code real quick just to show you some of the structure of this. This is using SuiteSync 1.0. You could just as easily do this in 2.0. And yeah, so let's just start walking through the code. So up here, there's just a couple of utilities. NetSuite does have a logging functionality, but uses kind of a long function name here, and you have to, preface it with a log level. So what I've done here is just make it really simple to log a message by just wrapping it in this easy log function. The other thing I've done here is add an isEmpty convenience function here, and this basically checks for a bunch of variants of empty, undefined, null, empty string. And the reason I use this generic isEmpty method is because you can't really ever know exactly what NetSuite's going to return. For instance, you could have a free-form field that is null, but then someone enters in a space and then deletes the space, and somehow it's now contains an empty string. So by kind of using this convenience method, it eliminates dependency on the exact implementation of a script setting a field or NetSuite's implementation of what blank or null actually represents in that field and that particular field type. Here's just a mapping of these currencies to the Stripe accounts, which we'll talk more about later. And this is just kind of a script level constant. And here is our after submit entry point. So this is going to be the function that we actually tell NetSuite to call in this particular JavaScript file. So this is a function that NetSuite's going to call based on the database events on their end. And what NetSuite passes in is a type. Depending on the type of event, you're going to get a different list of arguments that NetSuite will pass in. And the values here that NetSuite allows, there's more than just create or edit, but the values that NetSuite passes in for the type are clearly defined in their documentation. So you'll need to look there for kind of more information on what this type or other arguments for another event script would have. So in this particular case, the type represents essentially the mode that the record is operating under. So for this case, we only want to run this script if we're creating or editing the record. We don't want to run the script if we're deleting it, if we're viewing it. There's a bunch of other cases. So I've kind of whitelisted this script only to run if it's a create or edit mode. The other thing that I'm doing here, and this is more of a pattern that I've developed after kind of running through a bunch of different ways of writing scripts in NetSuite, is I pull the record type and the record ID out of the current context of the script that's running. And then I pass it off to this secondary handler. Now, these values are pulled from the current context, and I pull them into independent variables and hand them off to a handler so that we can test this script outside of the particular context, which is a user event that I'm working under. And the reason we need the type and the ID is this allows us to load up the record or pulls particular fields from a record without requiring it to be run in the same environment that the script will be operating under when it's live. Okay, so that's why there's this separate handler here, this process after submit. And this is going to essentially run the logic that will figure out the mapping between the data on the particular NetSuite record and then which Stripe account ID we want to set on this record. Now, I'm using the Stripe account ID just as an example. Obviously, this could be any sort of scripting requirement you have. You could be looking up an exchange rate. You could be making an API call. This logic is just an example that will probably encompass some of the things you'll need to do in your case. So, pulling some fields from a record, running some logic, and then submitting the data back to the NetSuite record. But you could do whatever you want in this block here. And this is just kind of associated with this logic. I'll go through that in a bit. The other thing I want to point out is this interesting kind of couple lines of code at the end. The execution context determines if the script is being run as a kind of like in a debugger. So NetSuite has kind of a debugger instance of their NetSuite account, or if it's being run as web services or a scheduled script. So you can kind of get an idea of what mode the script is operating under. Now, by adding this in here, this allows us to test the actual logic in our after submit operation here without trying to fake an after submit hook, or by actually submitting a record and seeing what happens. So it creates a much faster feedback loop. This debug line at the end just allows us to put a breakpoint in the debugger to stop here and inspect anything that's run so far. So this is just a helpful thing for debugging in the live NetSuite console. Okay, let's hop back up to the logic here and just walk through it real quickly. So what we're doing is determining a mapping key. So we're mapping some record on the, or some data on the NetSuite record to another value that we're going to submit to this field. So we check for a mapping key. If it's empty, then we just log that it's empty and exit the script. If it's not empty, then we submit a change to the particular record by passing in that record type and record ID along with the actual field that we want to submit a change for. And then we submit the value that we're going to change, which references that other kind of mapping hash that we had at the top of this file and uses that mapping key to pull a particular value out. So let's hop over to the mapping key because this is where kind of the interesting part is. What we're doing here is we're looking up a field. So this NetSuite API lookup field function, this is a lot more efficient than loading the entire record into memory. This just plucks a single field out of the NetSuite database for a particular record. So that's what we're doing here. We're passing in the record type, record ID, and then we want to grab the currency of the particular record, and that's what's being returned here. Now, you also might be wondering why I'm defensively checking if anything's empty. If you're just working in one NetSuite account, this isn't really required. But if this script may be deployed in multiple NetSuite accounts, or if your NetSuite account configuration might change a lot in the near future, you'll want to be really defensive about the values coming back. The reason being is there's lots of functionality in NetSuite that can change by just different configuration options being chosen. And what that's going to do is it might make the currency field disappear. For instance, if you disable the multi-currency feature in NetSuite, the currency field will totally disappear on the record and will return, nil or null or an empty string instead of a currency value, which is what you'd expect. So that's why there's all of these, is empty checks everywhere. So in this particular case, the currency field is actually a record reference field in NetSuite. So it's not a freeform text field. It's essentially a drop down that goes ahead and references another record in the NetSuite environment. So when we get the currency ID back, it's literally a number which represents a currency record. So that's why we then look up the ISO of the currency, the 3-letter kind of combination that represents that currency entry, by looking up a currency record, taking the currency ID, and then grabbing the symbol of the currency, which in NetSuite is equivalent to the ISO 3 representation of that currency. And again, I'm taking the currency ISO and checking it for empty because basically you never know. That value, that symbol can actually be set by the user. It isn't a static value in the NetSuite account. The other thing here is I'm just making the currency ISO uppercase. So this, you can kind of see the pattern of defensiveness here. The symbol value may change because of different NetSuite defaults when they set up the NetSuite instance, or it could change because a user went in and edited the symbol. So you really can't rely on too many static values in NetSuite. You have to treat everything as if it's dynamic. So basically this mapping key is either going to, this function here, determine mapping key, is either going to return a 3-letter currency code or nothing, which is why here, if it returns nothing, we exit. If not, then we hop up to this Stripe account mapping. So if we go up to the Stripe account mapping, we look up the currency code and we return an account ID. And so at the end of the day, this cust record Stripe account ID, or cust body Stripe account ID, I should say, which I'll explain the difference of that in a second. That field should be set when we edit the record based on the currency. Okay, now let's go ahead and create this custom field and create the script deployment. So a custom field in NetSuite is created by going to the customization area, list records and fields, and then transaction body fields. Now, the exact kind of option here that you choose, that's going to be dependent on exactly what type of custom field. For instance, you may want to create a entity field, which is a customer field, or a custom field on an item. So it really depends, but in most cases, the transaction body fields are going to be the most popular custom field to create. This is going to create a custom field on your sales orders, invoices, payments, refunds, customer deposits, cash sales, kind of every record that represents a financial transaction. And so in this case, that's what we want to do. So we're going to go over here and press new. And I have these values filled out for us here. So let's call this the Stripe account ID. We want it to be free-form text. So that's just going to allow us to enter in whatever we like. And we want to store the value. So that's going to allow us to actually for a value to stick in the form in the field instead of it being a formula that's just pulled dynamically. That's kind of another conversation, but in this case we need that to be checked. And then we want a description. So obviously description isn't required, but it's super helpful because as your NetSuite account changes or you add new people to your team, you're going to want to give some description about what's going on here. The other thing that's important here is an ID. So this ID starts with an underscore, which is kind of funny. But what's going to happen is when I press save, NetSuite is going to preface this ID here with their own kind of prefix that they use for custom fields. So that's why I want to start it off with an underscore. There is a field character limit here that's not documented. So if you type in too many characters, NetSuite will just truncate it and the ID won't be what you expect. The other thing we want to do is select which transaction types this field is going to be displayed on. These types are tricky because they don't correspond one-to-one to the actual types of transactions in NetSuite. For instance, a sale represents a sales order, invoice, or cash sale. Where a customer payment literally just represents a customer payment, but it doesn't represent a customer deposit, which is instead over here. So just be aware that if the field doesn't show up, you probably just need to do some trial and error and select additional options in this list. The other thing we want to do is we can actually just leave this as is. That determines where the field goes, but we're fine just... You know what? Actually, let's move it to the main subtab. So this is the kind of the header level of the invoice. And that's it. So we created the field. Now let's go ahead and create the script. So what we want to do is first, we want to upload a script. New script. Then we want to create a new file. So we start by creating a script file. Okay, I've selected that file we were working on, and I'll just call it the same thing. Press save. We want to create the script record. Okay, now we get to choose which type of script. So I mentioned before, this is a user event script. And here's where we set up what the user event script does. So we're just going to call this the custom Stripe account mapping script, set an ID. If you don't set an ID, just NetSuite generates one for you that's totally random. And so it's really important to set that ID, again, to just help future folks using NetSuite. And then we want to set the hook. So before load, before submit, after submit, and we just type in the JavaScript function that we're using there. And the other thing we want to do is set up the deployment. So you have like a script file, the script like record itself, and then the script deployment, which determines in what context it runs. So this is going to apply to invoices. And we want to mark it as deployed. If we mark it as testing, it won't run for all users. It will just run for us. So let's leave it there. And then the log level debug will determine what shows up in our log. So to start off, we're just going to use debug so we can see those log messages that we set up. One thing to note on the deployments, it looks like you can actually add multiple deployments here at once, but you can't. You're going to get an unexpected error from NetSuite. So just add one here, and then later on you can add more by creating individual script deployments. Okay, so we've set the script, and if let's go look back at our script here. We've set it up for USD and CAD with account 1 and account 2. And so if we go ahead and edit, because remember the type on the after submit was set to run for create or edit. If we edit a USD and CAD invoice, we should see different IDs pop up. So let me refresh this invoice and check to make sure that that Stripe account ID popped up. So there it is. And you'll notice that the ID here for this field has cust body in front of it. That's that prefix that NetSuite kind of prepends to your custom ID for that field. And that's this field ID here is what we set over here in the code. So that's how that works. Okay, so if I go ahead and edit this invoice, we should actually check the currency first, but we can check that when we're editing it. And just edit any field, so just the memo. We're just going to add a sample memo in there. It should update the Stripe account ID. Okay, first let's check the currency. Okay, Canadian dollars. And we're just going to add a bump memo. And you can see here that the Stripe account ID was set to 2. So let's go and double check that that's correct here. Yep, account 2. So now we need to check the USD side to make sure, just for testing purposes, that it actually changed correctly. Now, the one thing you might be thinking is, what if it's not USD or CAD? Well, in that case, you could add something here that instead of returning, goes ahead and sets a default value, right? So you might, instead of looking up the ID, you might set a default value here to kind of catch that edge case. But in our particular situation, we don't want to do that. And the idea is we would actually know all of the currencies that would be used, and we'd want to know by setting that field to blank if there's a currency that's new that's being used accidentally. Okay, so let's hop back over here and bring up this USD invoice and do the same thing, which is just kind of update the memo. And you can see the Stripe account ID is set to 1, or account 1. So our script's working, and at this point, obviously you'd want to do more testing than this if you're kind of developing scripts in the wild, but what we can do here is get the script ready for deployment. So you can see when we saved this script, it actually created a deployment for us, but it's still in test mode. So what we'll want to do is edit the script deployment, and set the log level to error, and set the status to released. Now, something to consider here is the execute as role. So what I'd recommend for most scripts, you want to set them to run as administrator. And obviously this totally depends on the type of script, but depending on a customer's individual role permissions, they might not be able to access particular fields. So by executing as a role with higher permissions, you eliminate the liability of writing a script that is dependent on a particular field, which that particular user may not have access to. And then that throws an error, which shows the user an error, and then they're coming back to you saying, why isn't this working? And it'll work on your account, but then not on their account. So the times when you'd want to not execute as a higher level permission role is when you really don't want that user to actually be able to run that script. Now, what I would argue in that case is you'd want to whitelist the particular roles that this script should execute under instead of executing as that specific role. But again, this is totally dependent on your particular context. So we change the status to released, we execute as an administrator, we update the log level so our logs aren't cluttered with a bunch of debug statements. The other thing we'll want to do is select the groups or the particular employees that you want this script to be executed under. In this case, I'm just kind of executing it for everybody. So I'm not being really specific here. But in your case, you'd want to kind of, be more fine-grained about setting that up. Then if we just, save the script deployment, we're good to go. And our script will be running for all users on the after submit event. So hopefully this is helpful. Feel free to email with any questions about the video, and hopefully this helps you kind of learn how to write scripts in NetSuite.